Detective Hawbaker stared at the suspect through the observation glass. She took mental notes of posture, clothes, and hygiene. After seeing countless suspects and witnesses from all over the spectrum of society in that very same seat squirm just from the thought of being there, this one had no such vibe. This one had to be the calmest and evenly composed of any of those before, especially the ones faced with a murder charge. Hawbaker took a step forward, placing a hand over her nose and mouth. She tried to look deep in thought about the suspect. In reality, she was trying to stifle the abhorrent smell of her captain's burnt coffee, that he loved the nurse all day, and her partner Neverrett's overdose of cologne. It was a nice mask for his pheromones, which were in hyperactivity, with it being his species' breeding season. It's times like this that Hawbaker hated her heightened senses, inherited through her sanguine physiology.
So what are your thoughts about this one, Hawbaker?
The captain asked. The captain's question caught her off guard, breaking her thoughts on possible scenarios. She chose not to answer with her real thoughts, instead choosing just to describe her earlier observations.
Well, first off, he's pretty well groomed. Then his attitude and posture make me think of the mafia or private security. With us unable to identify what his species is, could make him a smuggler of blood tech? But obviously he couldn't be a Terran with the fall he survived. He also has no visible scars, so that rules out Didactylus.
Neverett chimed in with his usual one-liner.
The Ministry?
Can't be. The Ministry always informs local enforcement officers when an operative is working in their district.
Hawbaker spoke with respectful indignation. Undeterred, her partner chose the next obvious choice.
The Order, then.
Which rang out with undue enthusiasm. Their captain intercepted the conjecture thrown at the back of Hawbaker.
No, the Order brands their agents so they can be followed or found easily.
Hawbaker didn't need the reminder, but Neverrett's pressed against the box thinking always seemed to line up the plot holes somehow.
He's a remnant of the Allied Legion.
Hawbaker announced more to herself and the one-way mirror than her colleagues.
Allied Legion?
Neverett spoke for both himself and the captain, who was choking on his coffee.
How'd you come up with that one, Hawes?
Neverett made no effort to hide his discouraging tone. Hawbaker paid no attention. Instead, she turned to her captain, who was wiping and blotting coffee off his person. Pausing his actions, the captain ran a thumb and forefinger through his broad salt and pepper mustache. Hawbaker had seen this before, many more times when he was shuffling all the information and theories about the case not so evidently clear, till the most plausible string of events fit concisely. After several brushstrokes, he turned his head only to face Hawbaker. He nodded slowly twice.
Your theory. Now go see if you can get it proven.
He spoke in his fatherly tone, reserved only for those times he knew the case was more trouble than it was worth.
How about his lawyer?
Hawbaker motioned towards the closed door that led to the squad room with a head tilt.
Well, he mentioned something about being asked formally by his client for his services.
With that, Hawbaker made her way to the interrogation room, all the while feeling the concern of Neverett's gaze on her back. Hawbaker turned to face him. Her partner slowly hunched over from his towering height of 7 feet to meet her eye to eye.
Be careful. He may appear Terran, but he doesn't smell like one, and the sigils he carries worry me.
His ice blue eyes were completely serious. Hawbaker gave Neverett 2 hearty pats on his bicep, not even sure if he could feel it through his dense bluish-black fur. Hawbaker stopped at the interrogation room door, hand on the doorknob to take one last breath.
So, what are your thoughts?
The captain asked Neverett without averting his gaze from the suspect while Hawbaker entered the interrogation room. Neverett let out a low growl unintentionally before speaking.
I don't like him. Something is wrong. The only viable option is that he's a witch in order to survive an explosion and fall 20 stories. But then, he should have floated down. Air manipulation is Tier 1 control for witches.
The captain stood at attention with his arms crossed over his chest, a gesture that Neverett had only seen one time before.
Something is wrong. I'm just not sure it's him we have to worry about. I have to make a call. Keep an eye on them.
The captain quickly left the observation room. Opening the door, Hawbaker found the suspect eyes closed, fingers interlocked before him on the table, sitting perfectly upright in the chair. He seemed to be in a meditative state. Taking a step inside the room, Hawbaker couldn't be sure, but it seemed like he was taking in her presence. He didn't move, but the air around him changed, like he was seeing her without opening his eyes. Closing the door behind her, thinking if he could really sense her. If he could, then that would make him either a sanguine or a benefican, or by a rare chance, a hybrid.
Where the men fail, a woman prevails?
His voice broke the silence of the room that had sat stale for a couple of hours. As detective after detective had tried to question him, Hawbaker didn't answer out of surprise. Not that he knew she was a woman, but that he had said anything at all. Shaking the surprise, Hawbaker took the seat across from him as the room dulled back into silence. She once him over, toed ahead. A pair of worn dress shoes and gray socks covered his feet, while the black pants from the observation room appeared normal. In this close proximity, Hawbaker was able to see now that they were made of some type of heavy canvas. While newer than the shoes, they also had been well put through their paces. Scuffs and small stitch repairs dotted them randomly. She continued her observations upward. Normal leather belt, then a short-sleeved lavender shirt covered by a black vest. Again, like the pants, the vest was made of heavy canvas, but there seemed to be an inner layer, making it much thicker and uncomfortable to wear. His arms were well-toned, but not muscular. His hands were rough and carried a multitude of scars and scrapes. Hawbaker didn't see any indication of the sigils that Never claimed to see. His face had soft features and no facial hair, but there was a ruggedness about them, like he had been hiding behind a smile for far too long. Short black hair covered his head. The styling was old traditional, something only seen in veteran fleet combat crews.
Let's start with the basics. What's your name?
Hawbaker's voice was firm and yet polite, always striking a balance to ease the tension. Unexpectedly, the suspect's right eye opened, as a smirk formed at the corner of his mouth. Taken aback by the change in his demeanor, Hawbaker leaned away a little. Something about this sudden change made her want to draw her weapon, as if sensing her discomfort. The suspect moved slowly, changing his position to one that was more proper and respectable. He squared his shoulders and tugged his shirt and vest smooth. When finished with his clothes, he placed both hands flat on the table, tilting his head to the side a bit. He narrowed his eyes as if trying to see her clearer.
You know, you're beautiful.
Hawbaker let out a quick sigh through her nose, having heard this same line over and over from people trying to get out of trouble.
The pose was a nice touch, but it's not going to get you out of here. I've heard that stated by everyone that sat in that chair.
With the suspect now looking at her, Hawbaker could see his eyes. There was no discernible silver streaks in them. That rules out him being a sanguine. That leaves benefican. Now Hawbaker just needed to know how powerful this witch was.
It was a question, not a statement.
He spoke with mischief. Hawbaker's features hardened as she ignored him. Placing a datapad on the table, she continued the questions.
Okay, why did you kill him?
She asked in a harder tone while pulling up a picture of a mangled body on the datapad and slid it in front of him. He didn't look down at the image or so much flinch at the question. Instead, he leaned back deep into his seat.
I thought you'd be different from the rest and make this more interesting. Detective...
He spoke, trailing off in a raspier tone, making Hawbaker think this may or may not be an ill attempt to feign arrogance. Taking the cue from his body language, she tried to draw him back to the table. She spoke her name in a soft, elegant tone.
Detective Hawbaker.
The suspect's face lit up with interest at her words.
Hawbaker. Is your family name new? I was sure I knew all the family names in Sanguine, even the lowest houses. Strange.
Hawbaker took a pause at his statement. The room returned to silence for a short while her thoughts played out. Then the suspect opened his mouth and spoke in a higher tone, like they had been long-lost friends seeing each other for the first time.
How about a game? A question for a question.
He spoke with animated hands as much as his voice. Hawbaker could not help the puzzled look that came over her face. She took a breath to speak, but he cut her off before any words could be formed.
The only rule is you must be truthful to all questions.
Hawbaker raised an eyebrow, while thinking to herself that he cannot be serious. The suspect paused so Hawbaker could reply this time, but she could not gather any words together out of disbelief.
Since I suggested the game, I'll give you a free one. My name is Dizvonik.
Hawbaker stared blankly at the man across from her, the shock from what had just taken place easily readable across her face. Leaning back in her chair, she crossed her arms as her mind began to leap to every possible conclusion. 3 beeps stopped her thoughts. She tapped a finger across her holoband on her wrist, bringing up a conversation window. Leverett had sent a message, informing her he was searching for the name the suspect had given. Another message popped up from her captain, informing her to play along with the game until they were able to confirm his identity. Hawbaker turned her attention back to the suspect. She observed the man's smirking face, hoping to get some kind of read, but he sat there, patiently waiting for her to ask a question. Composing herself mentally, she took a moment, making sure she could think of the right questions that would draw information out of him, without him receding like he did before. Taking a breath, she began at the beginning.
So where did you grow up?
The smile on Dzvonik's face somehow grew at the question.
Venefica. Not the planet below this station. The original, before the wars.
He spoke with solid dignity. Hawbaker studied him as he spoke. No body tells, no wandering eyes. From what Hawbaker could tell, he was being truthful. This statement would make him a witch, and over 255 years old, nearly older than the High Priestess herself. Hawbaker watched him as he interlocked his fingers and placed them on top of his head.
Why did you leave your family name behind?
Dzvonik was quick with his question.
It's the name of my betrothed. The name won't be added to the honored rolls, since he is a Tehran.
Hawbaker exaggerated her truth.
An arranged marriage. Very old-fashioned.
Dzvonik's voice dripped with interest.
Do you still serve the Allied Legion?
Hawbaker being equally quick with her question.
I took an oath to protect the people for as long as I live. Even from themselves, if necessary.
Dzvonik's tone was full of pride. It wasn't exactly a yes, but it confirmed enough. Dzvonik's smile faded into pursed lips, and his gaze shifted from her to the ceiling, then back to her, then back to the ceiling. Starting to feel disconcerted that it was taking him so long to think of a simple question, Hawbaker's leg began to shake on its own, rattling her seat. Dzvonik's eyes fell to her once more, and gleamed. Unlocking his fingers, he pointed at her with both hands.
I've got it! Who gave you that scar?
He made a diagonal chopping motion from her right to left. Involuntarily, Hawbaker's breathing stopped, while her left hand raised to her neck to grip the pendant that hung there.
That's the one,
he said, pointing at her left hand. Hawbaker's breath returned as she released her necklace and rolled her hand over to see the scar, letting out a low, slow sigh of relief. She had often forgotten about that scar, as no one ever noticed. She lifted her hand so that it sat between their line of sight. She rotated it over so that the palm faced him to let him know the full significance of its depth.
Working a case where the suspect had a sword-wielding bodyguard. Let's just say your hand won't stop a blade.
Lowering her hand to the table, she noticed that his eyes were fixated on it still. She glanced at it herself and realized he wanted the details.
The blade came down between middle and ring fingers, splitting my hand to the wrist, where it was stopped by the radius.
She added swiftly. His gaze returned to her with more respect. He raised an open hand to her, signaling it was her turn for a question. She started to ask another mundane question when a double beep came to her wrist. She turned to the observation room mirror, nodding twice, then turned back to Dzvonik wearing a smirk.
So how many people have you killed?
Her tone carried a little mockery in its delivery. Dzvonik's response was quick and to the point.
I'm sorry, that's the wrong question.
Hawbaker's smirk faded, her patience starting to wear thin. Another double beep came from her wrist. She just held up a hand this time, letting them know to give her 5 more minutes.
So what's the right question then? Or are you just trying not to incriminate yourself?
The annoyance cleared every aspect of Hawbaker's presence.
If I tell you that, then I win, and I get to walk out of here a free man, with no challenge or vain attempts to hold me here any longer.
Hawbaker scoffed, knowing that the double beeps from Neverin meant that he had found something against this guy. The smirk returned to Hawbaker's lips.
Fine, we have a deal. Tell me.
With a loud breath in, followed by a heavy sigh, Dzvonik fell back in his chair and spoke solemnly.
It's not how many people I've killed. It's how many people am I going to kill.
As if on cue, the door to the room burst open. Hawbaker's reflexes kicked in as she stood and whirled around to face the door, weapon drawn. She found her target to be Dzvonik's lawyer. Looking past the lawyer, Hawbaker found her captain telling her to stand down by shaking his head at her. Holstering her gun, the lawyer, who stood at what seemed to be 7 feet, glided into the room.
No more questions. Your jurisdiction no longer applies. I will not tolerate this unlawful detainment of my client any longer.
What the hell?
We are leaving, Detective. My client has done nothing wrong, so you can no longer hold him here against his will.
The lawyer interrupted her, his voice booming in the confined room. As he stopped in front of her, letting his height really sink in, Hawbaker stared up at him, unimpressed at his display or his stature.
Like hell you are, we have numerous eyewitness accounts placing him at the scene with the victim and others seeing him being thrown out of a 5th-story window. Not to mention the 30 or so that saw him land on the car we found him on. Speaking of the victim, there's still a body downstairs that's been identified as the one arguing with your client.
Hawbaker reached to the table with her left hand, picking up the data pad she had set down earlier. Her eyes never left the lawyer's face as she brought it up between them.
See for yourself.
The lawyer took the data pad from her casually. He flicked it on. Hawbaker watched him as he began reading the statements. He scrolled through page after page, skimming them, till he came to the photos of the mangled body. His gaze rose from the screen to Hawbaker, and then to his right, looking at Desvonik. Hawbaker turned her eyes to Desvonik as well. Like a child caught by both parents, Desvonik sat silent while his eyes darted back and forth from him to her. With a low, sheepish grin, he shrugged his shoulders at his lawyer, as if saying, "Oops." Turning back to Hawbaker, the lawyer handed back the datapad.
I'm sorry to tell you, but the information contained there seems to be out of date.
With that, he pulled a pad out of his suit jacket and held it up to her. Hawbaker couldn't help the look of annoyance that came across her face as she snatched the pad out of his hand. She began reading the first witness account. It was mostly the same, but all the important information had been changed. Too dark to see. Our eye was mistaken. Stopping, Hawbaker began flicking through the rest, pausing here and there to skim the statements, reaching the last one, which simply read, "Redacted." She opened her mouth to remind the lawyer about the body downstairs, only for Never to pop into the room, doubling over, panting heavily.
Gone,
Was all he was able to get out between breaths, looking past Never to the captain, who just simply shook his head again. It took all the willpower Hawbaker had not to curse aloud. Hawbaker lowered her gaze to the floor and spoke through her teeth.
Well, it seems that we were mistaken. You and your client may go.
Hawbaker's anger kept her eyes glued to the floor as she listened to the light footsteps of the lawyer walk out of the room, followed by a pair of heavier ones that stopped beside her.
May I speak with you in private for a moment?
He said this while attempting to close the door to the room. Never planted his hand on the door with a slap, holding it in place. Hawbaker waved him off. Never reluctantly let the door close.
If you're going to gloat, be warned. I may punch your nose into the back of your skull.
Hawbaker's will was the only thing stopping her rage from taking over and exorcising him from the room.
Nothing so trivial. I just wanted to return this to you since you dropped it earlier.
Hawbaker looked, finding Desvonik dangling a silver necklace from his right middle finger. Hawbaker knew it was hers the instant she saw the indigo crystal shard at the end of the chain. Still, her instincts told her to check, her left hand snapping to her neck. Not there. She then lashed out, grabbing at the end of the chain. Desvonik quickly clenched his fist, trapping the necklace. Hawbaker cocked her right fist back, ready to exert herself. She stared at him, waiting for him to release his grip, but he was too enthralled, his eyes fixated on the right side of her face.
I have seen plenty of shards of the priestess that heal. Yet, this is the first time I've seen one that bends reality.
Hawbaker unleashed her punch, with what she was hoping was about half her strength. Without knowing exactly how skilled he was with his powers, it made it difficult to gauge the amount of force he could endure. The punch landed with a satisfying smack, but not to its intended target. Her fist was caught in the grip of his left hand, as the recoil of the hit reverberated a dull ache from her hand into her shoulder blade. He eyed the right side of her face intently.
Beautiful.
His words spoken quietly as he quickly released the necklace and her hand. He then slipped out the door before any further retaliation could be made or spoken. Hawbaker's composure kept her in place, knowing full well that she could do nothing but get herself fired for chasing him down and breaking that smile of his. Hawbaker turned to the mirror to observe herself. She wore her typical detective outfit of slacks and a linen button-up shirt, though she preferred the short-sleeve version over its counterpart. She wore her sneakers instead of her dress shoes. It made more sense for chasing suspects. Her hair sat at shoulder length, deep brown with long curls. Then came her eyes, one bright hazel, the other a solid white, save for the black dot of her pupil. It took further courage than she thought to look at her own face. The 4-finger-width scars running down the right side of her face reminded her of a long-ago mistake. She turned away from the mirror, returning the necklace back to its rightful place. The necklace restored the illusion of an untainted complexion as Never leaned into the room.
What did he want?
He spoke with some concern in his voice.
To gloat.
Hawbaker's voice still full of malice and intent.
Wait, and he's still breathing through his nose.
Hawbaker pushed past him, making her way to sit at her desk. She placed her head in her hands so she could try and calm herself. Never followed, stopping at the side of her desk.
Hey, when you were playing that question game, how come you didn't ask him about his sigils?
Hawbaker lifted her head, turning to look up at him. The questioning look clear on her face. She didn't need to ask for Never to clarify himself.
The one in his right arm that looked like an ancient mace wrapped in chains? That's why I told you he was the Order.
Hawbaker's mood brightened up at the revelation.
Well, blessed be that wolf nose of yours, Nev.